explanations for rising costs paired with deceptive policy demands dressed up as truth with no evidence. In his budget address, which was light on discussing the budget and heavy on policy rhetoric, Governor Phil Scott presented a series of cause and effect claims about why Vermont is struggling and what must be done next. But when you take a close look at the rhetoric, what's left is a pattern: complex problems reduced to simple causes and solutions that are political choices framed as economic reality. We are here to say clearly that framing is wrong and it matters. First, education is not a key driver of our cost of living crisis. We were told once again that education transformation is the key not just to our schools, but to nearly every challenge that Vermont faces. That claim is not bold, it's convenient. Education didn't cause Vermont's housing shortage, runaway rents, or decades of underinvestment in childcare, healthcare, or rural infrastructure. We should not ask educators and students to carry burdens that belong to all of us. Governor Scott doesn't explain and has provided no evidence that his proposed reforms will save Vermonters a dime in property taxes. Progressives have more to say about education, but not this week, unless Senator Vyhovsky has something to add. Instead, Governor Scott shifts attention away from the real cost drivers of our education system and solutions for those: healthcare, neglected infrastructure, and equity reforms that are needed in our systems to deliver more opportunity for all young Vermonters. He shifts responsibility onto our education system and away from failed housing and economic policy. Second, federal uncertainty is not an excuse to do less. We're told that because federal funding is uncertain, Vermont must tighten its belt and lower its ambitions. But let's be clear, uncertainty does not force austerity. Austerity is a choice. When families face uncertainty, we will not tell them to stop fixing the roof, and we shouldn't stop making progress on our goals as well. Yet somehow, when government faces uncertainty, we're told the only responsible response is to pull back. That's not fiscal discipline, that's political ideology masquerading as common sense. What Governor Scott has left out is the historic windfall that higher income Vermonters are experiencing due to federal tax cuts. The top 5% of Vermonters are getting nearly $400 million per year in tax breaks, while working families earning less than $250,000 a year are being asked to pay more and get less. Small business owners and their employees, social workers, child care providers, and therapists are being asked to pay as much as 4 times more for their health insurance premiums. Vermont has more than enough resources to continue to advance our state's growth. Don't let Governor Scott's smooth rhetoric distract us from the reality that the wealthiest and highest income Vermonters are doing great, while the rest of us foot the bill. Third, we'd like to ask Governor Scott to start doing his job. The governor tucked one claim into his discussion of our housing crisis that I'd like to reframe. He issued an executive order on housing last spring that he claimed immediately lowered the cost of building a single-family home by $25,000. Let's be clear, the governor could have made the changes to our inefficient permitting systems without an executive order years ago. He's the governor, and he runs the government. He doesn't make policy, that's our job, but it is his job to make sure the government runs well, including bringing efficiency to all of our building permit processes. Similarly, Governor Scott could have taken action years ago to build more treatment and recovery beds and shelter beds. We need about a $200 million investment to build the infrastructure that we need there. But he didn't, and we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on ad hoc responses that don't address root causes or help Vermonters stabilize and move forward. Fourth, deregulation will not magically create affordability, but additional disciplined and targeted spending will. Governor Scott promised us that prioritizing education transformation and deregulation in housing, energy, and healthcare policy will reverse demographic decline, grow the workforce, and increase revenue organically. Those are great aspirations and goals, but we're promised a lot with no evidence that deregulation will do any of those things. None of those things just happen because we say the words. As a progressive and a democratic socialist, I would argue and can provide evidence that we can achieve those goals when our public investments are big enough, long enough, and targeted to the people being left out. When leaders present hoped-for results as guaranteed effects, they replace analysis with optimism, and optimism will not pay our rent or our health insurance premiums. 95% of Vermonters aren't confused. We're squeezed. We don't need simple stories. We need honest explanations and solutions that address root causes. We don't need false hope. We need our government to work for us so that we have real choices. The Vermont Progressive Party believes this state can do better than blaming simple causes for systemic problems. We believe in generating equitable revenue and building a budget that reflects reality, not deceptive rhetoric and ideology. And with that, I'll pass it over to Representative Chena.
Hello. Thanks for coming today. I'm Representative Brian Chena from Burlington, Vermont, Chittenden 15, which is part of the Old North End and most of the East District. Sorry. Over the past decade, Vermont has become increasingly unaffordable. This did not happen overnight, and it did not happen for just one reason. Economic stress has intensified social challenges, leading to mental health crises, substance use disorders, trauma, poverty, and human suffering. More Vermonters are vulnerable today than at any point in recent memory. Governor Phil Scott has repeatedly failed to meaningfully support our most vulnerable neighbors. Too often, the policies of this administration have weakened an already fragile social safety net. During and after COVID, Vermont had an opportunity to lead, to stabilize housing, and to end homelessness. Instead, mismanagement of emergency housing programs led to mass evictions and a sharp increase in homelessness. At the same time, Vermont has faced a growing polysubstance crisis involving opioids, stimulants, alcohol, and cannabis. Rather than responding with comprehensive public health solutions, the governor has leaned too heavily on the criminal justice system. These approaches do not address the root causes of harm. They deepen them through incarceration and state violence. You can't incarcerate your way out of a public health emergency. This is not reform. This is not recovery. It is throwing money at a broken system. And let's be clear, homelessness is expensive. Incarceration is expensive. Emergency health care is expensive. We are paying more while getting worse outcomes. We must reinvest resources away from incarceration and into community care, such as education, health care, housing, and food access. The housing crisis cannot be solved through deregulation alone. We need intentional public and private investment in affordable housing infrastructure. That means supporting tenant ownership, renovating multi-unit owner-occupied housing, expanding cooperative and collective ownership models, and building transitional housing. We must also invest in self-sufficient, resilient neighborhoods designed with sustainability in mind through localized energy production, regenerative agriculture, and circular waste systems. And housing must be paired with social infrastructure, including workforce training, shared tools, labor pools, healthcare, and food access. Housing policy must center those who've been left behind: people experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities or substance use disorders, justice-involved individuals, DCF youth, seniors, and our agricultural workforce. Public land can be used to integrate affordable housing into existing communities as part of mass social and economic recovery. We must move forward with the promise of Act 48. Universal health care is not a failed idea. What has failed is a privatized, insurance-driven system increasingly dominated by private equity firms that extract profit, dismantle infrastructure, and abandon our communities. That does not create more choice. It creates chaos and suffering. Vermont can choose a bold path forward, one rooted in care, dignity, and long-term solutions. The cost of inaction is simply too high. Next up, we have Senator Tanya Vihofsky.
Hello. At a time when we are facing the catastrophic loss of federal funding and working class Vermonters are crying out for economic relief, the premise that we can build a budget the same way we always have is not just flawed, but deeply irresponsible. I agree with the governor that we need to prioritize protecting our most vulnerable, making Vermont more affordable, and growing our economy. But that's where most of my agreement ends. We are proposing budget priorities that fix structural issues for long-term change, while ensuring that those who are set to take huge federal tax cuts pay their fair share, while lifting the financial burden off of the Vermonters who simply cannot pay more. Unfortunately, the governor has once again proposed a budget that simply cost shifts, moves backwards on progress we have made, and in fact hurts the most vulnerable Vermonters. If we want to talk about affordability, let's start with the elephant in the room, education spending. The premise that Vermont has one of the highest per pupil spending rates, which is a favorite talking point of this administration, is an incomplete and disingenuous talking point. We don't have the data to compare our per pupil spending rates to other states, since we include far more spending categories in our calculation than any other state does. Of course our per pupil spending looks wildly out of control when that figure includes all of our social service spending and our teacher pension ADEC payments. Massive budget line items like social service spending that is not included in any other state's education fund, of course, skews this data. Comparing apples to oranges for a compelling talking point muddies the already cloudy waters of understanding our education costs. Second, the idea that the teacher pension is a major cost driver that is doing nothing but sucking up resources in the general fund is at best uninformed, and at worst is intentionally disingenuous and harmful. Our teacher and state worker pension system has an incredible return on investment. For every dollar spent into the pension, we see nearly a $4 return in money spent in the Vermont economy. The pension is a promise that we have made to these public servants, providing vital services to Vermonters. And not only is it a major economic driver, the legislature worked quite hard in conjunction with those employees to come to a compromise to fix the pension system, to be sustainable and fully funded by 2038. And that plan is on track and working. Moving from a property tax to an income-based tax not only lessens the burden on working and middle-class property taxpayers by taxing their actual income and not how much their property is worth, which is out of their control, it increases overall revenue by taxing those Vermonters who have income levels that their working-class neighbors could only dream of. More than a decade ago, income-based education funding was projected to bring an additional $90 million into the education fund. That number is surely even higher now as wealth inequality continues to grow. Quite simply, income-based education funding raises needed revenues beyond what is available now through the property tax. There is no ethical way that we can continue to ask low and middle-income Vermonters to pay a significantly higher percentage of their resources in a property tax than their wealthiest counterparts do, especially as our highest income Vermonters stand to benefit from Trump's tax cuts that will put more money in their pockets while gutting our vital services. Now, if we want to talk about reforming our actual highest cost drivers, we cannot toss aside healthcare reform and paint it as something that cannot be fixed, while offering, or can be fixed, with offering more low-cost, high-deductible plans to families who deserve better coverage, and promising innovation in rural healthcare with federal grant funds that do not address the current crisis that many Vermonters find themselves in right now with an inability to afford their healthcare. The basic fact is that we have the highest cost healthcare system in the nation, and thus the world. And we certainly do not have the healthiest population to go along with that financial burden. Increased competition between providers will not fix this. We need to work towards transforming our healthcare system to a universal system. And we need to continue to support the Green Mountain Care Board's increased accountability work. And we need to stop throwing money at far too many highly paid executives and start putting that money towards patient care. Finally, The idea of doubling down on the criminalization of substance use disorder as a way to protect our most vulnerable Vermonters fails both financially and ethically, and it ignores evidence-based research that shows what a spectacular failure the war on drugs and the use of prison to treat trauma is. It is certainly a choice to ignore decades of data, but it's not a good choice. At the cost of approximately $100,000 a year to house one individual in prison, incarceration is the most expensive way to deal with criminal offenses and the least likely to lead to lower recidivism. And that doesn't account for the emotional and financial toll it takes on families who have an incarcerated loved one. I cannot for the life of me understand why we as a state would want to spend precious resources on the most expensive and least successful method of addressing crime and substance use disorder. Using congregate shelters to warehouse unhoused people, making treatment contingent on a rigid set of qualifications, and reinforcing the stigma of substance use disorder as a moral failing will do nothing but move us back 30 years to a tough on crime drug policy that is widely regarded as a failure for everyone except for-profit prisons and the for-profit health system. If the governor wants to truly protect Vermont's most vulnerables, I invite him to review S91, the bill we passed last session that he decided to veto. After significant research and testimony and a carefully thought out conference committee, we mapped out a reformed motel program that brought online a comprehensive statewide program of support, housing, and care. I agree with the governor that we must center protecting the most vulnerable, making Vermont more affordable, and growing our economy. Unfortunately, the governor's budget and policy proposals miss the mark on all of this. He is once again proposing austerity for the most vulnerable, cost shifts that will ultimately cost us more, and no plan to create the infrastructure or build the educated populace that would actually grow our economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have time for questions.
How can you guys say that the governor is proposing austerity when his budget is the highest it's ever been?
Yeah, so it is basically all things are normal kind of budget, just a continuation on prior years. But what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now indicates to us that in coming years we are going to see increasing deficits in our state budget that the governor didn't even address. So we know that with changes to Medicaid that have already begun, we're starting to see fewer people being covered by Medicaid. Then we're going to see fewer and fewer and fewer resources coming to us from Medicaid spending for our state, and it's going to absolutely hollow out our healthcare system in a place where healthcare already is extraordinarily expensive. He didn't even reference those changes to Medicaid that are coming around the bend. Okay. He said we need to do more about housing and recognized that the investments that we've made in housing have been really successful but weren't enough. But then his solution was just to deregulate. So in other words, one of the things that the governor would like to do is deregulate in a way that might cost less to build a new single-family home in a wetland that's going to flood every year. There's no plan, there's no reserve being made for the flood recovery work that we know that we're going to need to do with a completely dysfunctional FEMA. We could go on and on and on about the knock-on effects of the big, beautiful bill that haven't even been felt in Vermont yet. And another thing that he didn't talk about at all was the loss of ACA subsidies for people who have to buy health care on the exchange. We're talking like an additional up to $30,000, $40,000 a year spent on health care by working families in Vermont, and he had nothing to say about it. We cannot add additional revenue to our state budget fast enough, and we could be doing a lot more to put systemic solutions in place at the state level than we're doing right now, and the cost is going to be felt by working Vermonters for years, decades.
Do you guys support the initiative by the Public Assets Institute, I think, to do a property tax increase that precisely reflects the savings from the federal federal income tax reduction?
Yes, I just submitted my bill yesterday, and Senator Vyhovsky already has a bill number. We have been working together and taking sort of the most progressive of Public Assets Institute's proposals to claw back the Trump tax cuts for those with incomes over $250,000 and increase the second home tax. Tanya's welcome to say more, but we'll be speaking much more about this in weeks to come. We'll hold another press conference on that topic.
Yes, so in the Senate, S280 was introduced, I believe, yesterday, and does exactly that. It is exactly what Representative Logan spoke to. It takes those most progressive policies. And I think to answer your previous question about how we can speak about austerity with a $9.4 billion budget, yes, it's probably one of the biggest budgets, if not the biggest budget Vermont has ever seen, but costs are out of control. Of course, the budget gets bigger each year. The cost of living gets bigger each year. But when I look at what's prioritized in that budget, it is not taxing the wealthiest Vermonters to pay to support the services. You know, we look at our mental health system that's been level funded year after year after year. I don't actually know if it's level funded in this budget, but it would have to have a pretty significant increase to actually just keep up with inflation. And that's what I see again and again, is an unwillingness to explore the idea of income-based education funding, which would funnel additional revenue. Unlike what was said in the budget address, it will not take money away from existing programs because that's revenue we don't currently have. An unwillingness to look at taxing vacant second homes that we live in a state where many Vermonters can't afford a first home, and yet we tax those vacant second homes at the same rate, which is inequitable. And so I look at the longer range and sort of more holistic picture when I look at where we are not making investments and where we are unwilling to raise revenue, and that's where I come to the statement of austerity. The S280 also does include a second homes tax. It does have a deer camp exemption. But it does look to have a rate of 200% of the residential property tax. And that, again, is revenue we do not currently have. And so when we have a governor that for a decade has said no new taxes, he's simply not accounting for the incredible increase in the cost of everything. I don't know if he has a magic money tree that I'm unaware of, but we cannot increase the needed services without new revenue.
Can I just say something about austerity? That I've been here 10 years. It has been an austerity budget the whole time. So this budget is following a tradition of spending money on broken systems, something the governor said we can't throw money at a broken system, but he's proposing a budget that throws money at broken systems and then criticizes education and singles that system out without looking at the broken healthcare system, without looking at the broken criminal justice system, including incarceration. He bragged about rounding people up and sending them to jail, an expensive option to solve a public health problem that doesn't work. So I think those are further points that reinforce our statement that this is an austerity budget. Sorry, I wanted to just...
Okay. I feel like there is this, it's fair to say, like inevitability in the way that leadership and the House and Senate talk about moving forward with what was in Act 73 specifically. How do you, I guess, push back against that sense of inevitability that we have to do it this way when that's the position of leadership?
Absolutely. I mean, that's tricky. As a former community organizer, I don't think we do it only from within the building. I think we have to work, with the Vermonters all over the state who are also opposed to that inevitability. I certainly have been in this building facing inevitabilities before. The inevitable draconian cuts to our state worker and teacher pension system were my first year in this building, and with the work of people in the building and the incredible lift of the teachers and state workers, we stopped that inevitability. I do have, I think it's S229, which is a bill that gets at repealing the most dangerous parts of Act 73 while moving forward, but we're going to talk more about that at our press conference next week. We have a whole education conversation, but I think it is building inside-outside partnerships. I don't think that we are going to solve the education problem within the silo of this building. We have to listen to the people who are doing the work, and I've worked in our schools. I will tell you they're not over-resourced. I assure you they're not having lobster dinners. they are struggling to get by. They are struggling with an increased educational need. They are struggling with increased social service needs. They too are impacted by the substance use crisis. They too are impacted by the housing crisis, and all of that drives up costs, and none of those are the largest cost driver, which is the cost of healthcare. And so I think we have to look holistically, and we have to work with our partners outside the building to push back. Like I said, I've got a little bit of experience with that from my first year fighting the pension plan.
I'd like to add to that. One of the most important things that your readers and listeners and viewers could do is contact your representatives, your senators, and the governor's office and ask them how much their plan is going to save taxpayers. Because I haven't seen an account, personally. We're being told that it's going to save us money, but we haven't been shown. We've seen no fiscal modeling to that end. It seems intuitive that if we shift off some of our administrative costs in our education system, that we'll be able to save money and maybe economize by sharing services, but it's just so much more complicated than that. We, and frankly, I have to admit that I see the pathway that we're on as a means to a right-wing privatization of our education system. The plan that the governor has been proposing would make it easier for us to have vouchers for school districts. And if you see a small community school close, you're probably going to see a private charter school open with vouchers. That's what we've seen happen in the rest of the country. That's the path that Governor Scott is on in every other policy area that he states his opinions on. It's from the same national Americans for Prosperity playbook that wants us to deregulate and privatize our public resources. This year, I want more fiscal information on Act 73 and how it is supposed to lower our education costs, and when, and by when. How much is it going to cost to make that transition? When would we start to see cost savings? There has been no rigorous fiscal analysis of any of the proposals. We're just supposed to take it on faith that this is going to save us money in the end. We're all, I think, open to reform in our school system. I think that there are ways that we could save money. Sure, you can always learn how to do things better. But I just haven't seen the evidence for the proposals that they've given us.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Next week.
Yeah.
I do want to say something more, but your question about Act 73, I believe, was how are we going to turn the ship if the captains are focused in a certain direction? You didn't say it that way exactly.
No, that's the metaphor.
I think the way to turn the ship is to highlight that there is no evidence that Act 73 is going to save money if we don't take care of two big problems: healthcare and retirement. We heard the governor say that the pension funds are slipping. That was the economic crisis that led to the Snelling surcharge in Vermont, where we had a Republican governor, a Democrat speaker of a Republican majority House, and a Democratic Senate come together in a compromise for a multi-year surcharge on the wealthiest Vermonters to dig us out of the hole so that we would come out of the red as a state. But at that moment in history, we failed to deal with the pensions. And then we took some bold steps over the last few years to do so, and we're continuing to slip with pensions. So that's a big issue. And healthcare costs for the personnel are a big issue. Until we get those costs under control, we can do all the reform we want. I think we're going to fail. And I think highlighting those 2 points, focusing on providing universal healthcare, and why not universal retirement? Why not a universal retirement system in Vermont? Because I have to say, as a healthcare worker, it is not fair that I provide services that I can't even afford to get, and that some public workers get a pension and others don't. And that division, it splits us. Let's unite and let's provide universal retirement, universal health care, create these things as a public good, and by doing so and addressing those costs, we can guarantee the public good of education. So that would be my case for how to derail it, is to focus on the things that are actually going to make a difference for everyone. Build something together instead of tearing something down, It was a metaphor for the times we were in.
This is a tiny bit in the weeds, but does the caucus have a position on the governor's plan to kind of end the transfer of the purchase and use tax revenue from transportation to the ed fund? Like, do you think that is a wise move? I know you're on transportation rather than Tomlinson, but yeah.
Sure. I would say that in a vacuum, making that transition back to having the full purchase and use tax go to transportation makes sense. And I would rather not have to raise regressive taxes such as the gas tax. But in the context where there's no willingness to consider actually taxing those who have the capacity to pay more, that is just going to end up transitioning more of the burden on working class folks in the form of property taxes or into more Doge-esque cuts to our schools. So I think without that broader vision and willingness to consider strategies for generating the revenue we need for this moment, I can't support it.
Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Come next week for the education.
I have so many more things to say.
Yeah.
Same time, same place next
Yeah.
Thursday.
Different,
Yeah.
same topic as the
Different
governor
topic.
at every speech.
You'll find out about your
Wow. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
I think the plan is not to reform